Welcome to #Wednesdays Weekly, a weekly information session in collaboration with voluntary sector and public sector partners. Today's session is from Citizens Advice, Good Help, and it's being delivered by Ali Darwin. Over to you, Ali.
Hi, everyone. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. Hopefully you can all hear me clearly. So my name is Ali. I'm the account manager for energy services at Citizens Advice, and we cover Stockport, Oldham, Rochdale and Trafford. I've been around for a long time in advice, probably, 13, 14 years. And I've kind of managed quite a few different areas of advice. So this session will be covering debt, benefits, and energy as well. My specialty is debt. I've gone a bit more in depth with the debt part of the session only because I think debt is going to become a big thing going forward. So this is actually aimed at people who are frontline staff. So it gives you a bit of a general idea of what to be thinking about when someone comes to you for an energy issue, a debt issue, or benefit issue, and gives you some insight into the sort of things that you need to be considering if you are going to refer the person to a specialist advisor as well. Okay, so I'm going to share my slides. There are links within the slide, so you'll be able, when it gets sent to you, you'll be able to click on those links to access additional information on anything that I've talked about. And just keep popping your questions in the chat and we'll answer it at the end. Okay. Right. Just share my tab with everyone. So can everybody see that now?
Yeah, we can see.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so if we're all ready, I'll make a start. So the first section is obviously debt. So if someone comes to you and they have a debt issue, then the main thing that you need to be thinking about first and foremost is whether they have an emergency. So an emergency would be anything detailed on there. So it will be where they're facing eviction. So they've had a possession letter telling them they're due to be evicted, or they've actually had an eviction date where the bailiffs are going to come and change the locks. If they've got bailiffs, if they're saying to you, I can't afford to eat, I can't afford to heat my home, my gas and electricity has been cut off, I have no credit. If they're due to be arrested for anything, that's also an emergency. So if anything like that comes up, then it's important to obviously think about time limits linked with that. So the first thing you'd be saying, okay, I understand this has happened, but you're thinking, are there any time limits for us to take action? So for example, if someone has had a warrant for their arrest, we might want to quickly contact the courts to try and see what we can do to obviously mitigate that. And I'll cover that a little bit later on. If someone's had a court document come through, then there's a limited amount of time to fill that in. So it's always important to sort of, if there is an emergency, when did you get the letter? Does it mention any time limits on there for us to obviously take action? So that's the first thing that you would be checking when someone comes with a debt issue. The next thing that you want to look at is the capability of your client. What can your client do? How capable are they? Do they have disabilities? Do they have health conditions? This can actually affect the overall, the next steps you take, so to speak, for that client. Because obviously, if that client doesn't have internet access, then you wouldn't be signposting them to any online resource. You may be looking, right, this client possibly needs to go face to face or home visit, or a service that offers some sort of video option, Zoom option or Google Meet option. If the person, I don't know, is struggling to explain their situation, it's clear that there might be a health condition or a disability, then obviously it's exploring whether there's a support worker, someone who helps them that you can maybe get in touch with consent, obviously, from the client. Once you've assessed their capability, then you need to obviously explore the issue they've come to you with. And this can affect the overall outcome for the client. So you want to know whose name the debts are in. Are they in a single name? Are they in the joint name? If they're joint debts, then obviously a lot of them will carry joint liability. So for a debt advisor, for them, they would be thinking, there's no point me sort of helping this one person, especially where they're a couple, because so something like council tax, it might be one person's name, but it carries joint and several liability, which means that basically, um, if the council can't contact whoever's named on the bill, then they'll be looking to see which other adult lives in the property, and they are within their rights to obviously pursue that other person. So there's a hierarchy of liability for council tax. And for me as a debt advisor, if someone comes to me and says, I have £2,000 council tax, I'm married, then what I'd be thinking is there's no point me helping just that person. I'd be saying, can I speak to your partner? Because if, for example, they want to go for insolvency where the debt gets written off, it will get written off for one person, but not for the other, which means the household is still at a detriment. So it's important to look at the household and make sure that whatever option you're offering them covers the whole household rather than just the one person. You'd obviously want to know if the debts are disputed. Now, if the debt is disputed, what we'd be doing for the client as a debt advisor is very different. We may not go through a full-on appointment that includes a budget and all of that at that stage. We would be thinking, right, well, let's look, is there legislation to back up any argument we're making? It's more about writing letters to the creditor to try to negotiate whatever it is, find out what's happened. So it would change how we would initially deal with that client when they come to us. And then you want to talk about business debt. So with business debts, as an advisor who does individual debt advice, we wouldn't normally deal with business debts. We would refer the person to business debt line because that is their forte. That's what they do, and they're better placed to give advice to that client. The only time that we would usually get involved where there's a business debt is if the client has been a sole trader, because with a sole trader, those debts are usually in their own name. So they carry debts associated with the business themselves individually. And if they're no longer trading, if they're still trading, we would still send them to business debt line. But if they're not trading, then they're carrying those business debts and we would be able to support that person. If they've run a limited company, then we can't really help because usually liability for debts lies with the company and not the individual person who's running the company. And there are insurances in place as well to kind of deal with that if the company goes bust. The next thing to look at is, have they had advice before? Are they getting advice at the moment? So if someone says, I've spoken to business debt line, that they're helping me with XYZ, then you would be encouraging them to go back to business debt line because they already have someone supporting them. You don't want to refer to someone else, although just to avoid duplication. If they're saying, well, I'm not happy with national debt line, which I'm sure nobody says, then you would probably say, okay, well, what have they done? What have they done for you so far? And you make note of what that is before you then signpost them. So the debt advisor knows these are my next steps. Is there something they've already done? Do I need to terminate that? Do I need to cancel that before I then step in and help out? And the last one would be, what have they done before? So have they had a debt relief order, which is a form of insolvency before? Have they been bankrupt before? Are they in a debt management plan with somebody? The reason we ask this is because there are options where once you've been in one, there's then a limited time before you can go into another. So things like breathing space, there's a limit on how many you can go into, especially if it's the standard breathing space. A DRO, you can't have another for 6 years. So we want to know that information. So it's always worth asking that question. Next thing would be, what are the debts? What type of debts are there? So in the debt world, there's what we call a priority and a non-priority. A priority debt, all you need to remember is it's a debt where if you don't pay it, something serious can happen. So you can lose your home, rent and mortgage arrears. You could lose your liberty if it's a criminal court fine that they've not paid. Council tax, you can be imprisoned for if you're willfully refusing to pay. It is rare, but it can happen. So things like that you'd be thinking about. Loss of goods and services, so hire purchase agreements, gas and electricity, which can be cut off. And just to get a feel for everyone, does anyone know what the other debt is that most people seem to think is a priority, but actually isn't? Can anyone think what it is? Feel free to come off mute or put something in the chat. It's okay if you don't know. That's allowed to. That's why I'm here to tell you. It would be water. That's right, Bernie. So it is water. So we get a lot of people come to us and they kind of say, oh, ask what are your priority debts? This is what a priority debt means. And they're sort of saying to us, well, my water, what about my water? Water is not a priority debt because you can't be cut off from your water. So it's always important to obviously say to the client, you're not going to be cut off. They can go to court like with any other debt, but they're not going to cut your water off. Then non-priority debts are debts where the sanction, what happens if you don't pay isn't as serious. It can be serious in that they can go to court, but it can take a while. Normally you get a default letter, and then usually they'll just keep sending you letters to chase it. Sometimes they'll send it to debt collectors. So it can go on for quite a while before they then take you to court. When they do take you to court, then obviously you'd have court documentation. At that point, that's probably an emergency. We'd want to fill in the forms, respond to the court documentation they've received, either make an offer or decide we're going to go and dispute it. Because if you don't actually turn up to a court hearing, then obviously they make a decision in your absence, and then that person can go to the bailiffs, obviously apply to the courts to have bailiffs enforce the debt. So we don't want to leave it till it gets to that stage. Okay. Give me a second. I've just lost my windows. Okay. So I've put on here some common priority debts that you need to be aware of. So there's a little list on there, and it just goes, is things like court fines, usually anything from HMRC, we would obviously class as a priority debt, mainly because HMRC do have additional powers to enforce debts. So it's always important that you treat those as a priority. And then you have things like, obviously there's maintenance, TV license. A lot of people just seem to think, oh, it's okay not to pay TV license, but TV license is, still a criminal offense not to pay that. And it will usually be enforced in the magistrate's court. And if you are fined, it will be a criminal fine. So it's always important to obviously address those where possible. What we do get quite commonly is clients say, oh, I don't pay a TV license. And then you say, well, do you watch TV? And they go, oh, well, I only watch, stuff on my computer and watch, catch up. And they usually still need a TV license, especially if they're watching live TV on their laptop, perhaps not catch up. But it's worth always exploring what is happening with the TV license as well. Okay, so budgets. Now, budgets are like without a budget, a debt advisor cannot do anything with anybody's debt. You have to have a budget. You can't advise, you can't negotiate, you can't speak to any credit. It's pretty much the foundation of debt advice. And I think even if you're not doing the budget for your client, it's worth always saying to the client, go away and do a budget. I'm going to send you to Citizens Advice for debt advice. Before you go to appointment, do a budget. And there are loads of budgets online that people can use. And most of them are really good as long as they've got a section for savings, income and expenditure, and your debts. You're usually okay. So if a client comes to a debt advisor and they have even written down what they spend on a piece of paper, that always helps us. You should be able to detail obviously assets, as I said, any surplus income, any deficit income. And if you're going to send someone to do one for themselves, then these are some of the informations they need to have with them. So they need pay slips, bank statements, any receipts that they're keeping as well. Another thing that budget really helps with is to actually get the client thinking about how they spend their money. And I've had many challenging conversations around budgets. So, an example that I've had has been a family of eight, so mom, dad, six children. Uh, Mom and dad get disability benefits, a couple of children get disability benefits. So, there's quite a lot of benefit income coming into the household. But then when you kind of look at the budget, they're telling me, well, we spend £500 per child for Christmases and birthdays. And when you total that up, it's like £6,000 in a year just being spent on Christmases and birthdays, and they're struggling to pay their debts. So people like that, or people who have had an eviction notice, they're about to lose their homes, but they're arguing about paying £500 a month towards a hire purchase agreement. And you do have to say to that person, well, if you lose your home, are you going to live in your car? Because that's all you've got, which is more important. And it's all about your priorities. So with the family, I was kind of saying, well, these are the alternatives. You may want to think about having a conversation with your children. And saying we can't afford this year, we need to reduce slightly, or saying we're going to crafting, create some sort of presents for them, go for things that are a little bit cheaper. It doesn't need to be branded. So as a debt advisor, you would be having those conversations with your client, picking out the high levels of expenditure for Sky or whatever it is. You're not telling them what to do and how to spend their money. You're just doing, you go through what they tell you they spend, and you do a suggested budget, and you show them the difference between the two. In the suggested budget is where you've cut back, reduced the amounts on certain things, and usually you release a lot of disposable income, and suddenly they can afford to pay 20, 30, 40 pounds to XYZ. And obviously, we need that if we're going to negotiate. And something to bear in mind is that if it's a priority debt, council tax, rent, mortgage, then they will challenge expenditure on a budget. If you send it with, if you send it off and it's got high things on there, they will come back and say, well, no, we're not going to accept £5 because they're paying £250 to Sky. They need to go on to the basic package. So they are allowed as a priority creditor to challenge a budget. So you have to have that conversation beforehand. At the bottom, there's a link for making the most of your money. That's just basically some of the options we offer to clients on ways to cut back, sort of like taking on a lodger, looking at your phone contract. Can you go and pay as you go rather than monthly? But there's a whole host of things on there which you'll be able to access and have a look at. So the next slide talks about the options that we would normally sort of look at if we're dealing with a client. So when it comes to debt, you have formal options and informal options. A formal options is usually bound by law, by the Insolvency Act. It's usually administered by the Insolvency Service. If someone goes into a formal option, it really limits the action the creditor can take to enforce that debt. Usually there's not a lot they can do. Some of them are options where you pay some's written off. Some are options where you write off the whole amount, and some are options where you pay the whole amount. But they do have legislation linked with them. Informal options are things like debt management plans, token offers, pro rata pay, everything listed here, where you can do them, but it doesn't stop the creditor from taking additional action. They usually won't unless you default on that agreement you've made with them, because there are Financial Conduct Authority guidelines that mean that they have to work with you to try and deal with your debt. But it doesn't stop them from obviously taking you to court, for example. So I've kind of put in brackets next to each one whether you need some surplus income or you don't. So surplus income is basically what's left after you pay your essential bills, your gas, water, rent, food, things like that. So token payments, if there's hardly any money left, you can maybe offer £1 to people if they're non-priority creditors. If they're priority creditors, then you would take all of the amount and give that to the priority creditor, and then just basically go back to the non-priority creditors and say, there's no money. Can you just put it on hold for us for a little while? they're winning, they're going to get an inheritance, £5 million in 3 months, we'll clear all the debts at that point, things like that. So it's you can negotiate using these tactics. So if someone, for example, is going to start a new job in a couple of months, then you could potentially say, put it on hold for us, or we'll offer you £1 for now, but this is going to happen, and here's the offer letter. And most creditors will work with you. You then have things like write-off requests. They're rare, but they do happen. I've seen loads. I've had one, a client who he had a life-changing accident at work. There was one of these tractors, I think, fell on him. One of the things hit him or something. I can't remember. It's been a while. But he couldn't go back to work. He couldn't work anymore. He was in hospital for months. His wife had to become his carer, so she couldn't work. So she went on carer's allowance, and he was on disability benefit. And he had an MBA credit card of about 10 grand. And we managed to get that cleared as a gesture of goodwill by writing a letter, sending evidence about his illness, what had happened, and they wrote it off. But it's always worth exploring if there is a good reason for it. And we've had 60, 70, 80 grand written off from multiple creditors on the basis of obviously someone's life has changed. They're never going to be able to pay that debt. So I'll cover pro rata and debt management together because they're very similar. Pro rata payments are a debt management plan. The only difference is with pro rata payments, you do it yourself. With the debt management plan, there's usually a third party that administers it for you. So if a client comes to me and they have 2 debts, I might encourage them, and they have money to pay, £50 a month, I'd encourage them to maybe look at pro rata payments. And what we do is I give them a template, which I put all the letter templates on there. You go on it, you put in your name, address, how much you want to offer, the creditor's name, address, it generates a letter. And then the client can send that off, set up a direct debit standing order, and they just make the payments every month. So they do it all themselves. With a debt management plan, they pay their £100 to that company, who then shares it out to everybody. So they do all the admin work for you. So if a client has like 15 debts, it's probably better to get them to do it. But all I'd say is encourage the person to look for one that is free. There are debt management companies out there. You don't want to be paying fees because a lot of what you pay each month will go to fees and not to your debt, and you'll forever be in a debt management plan. The only other thing to add is if a debt management plan is going to last longer than 5 years, as a debt advisor, we'd maybe have a conversation about looking at a formal option, because you don't want to be forever in debt. Ideally, you want to get a fresh start as soon as possible. Okay. Now, these are the formal options for dealing with debt. So a few of you might have heard of Breathing Space. It's relatively new. I think it's 2021 it was introduced. It's administered by debt advisors, so you can't do it yourself. And it's just basically a short-term hold, 60 days, whilst you're getting debt advice, while you're gathering information. Debt advisors use it a lot if they're trying to go for insolvency, but they need to gather information about the debts and all the rest of it, assets, whatever it is, before they do it. There's another breathing space, which is a mental health breathing space, and the limitations on that aren't as much as the standard breathing space. So with a standard breathing space, once you've been in one, I don't think you can go into another for a couple of years, if I'm right. With a mental health breathing space, you can stay in it as long as you're getting crisis support for your mental health issue. So for me as an advisor, to put a client in a mental health breathing space, I would need documentation. I would need to be in contact regularly with whoever their mental health nurse is, consultant, whatever it is. But you can go in it and be in it for as long as you need, basically. And then we've got the statutory debt repayment plan. I've put that in there because it's not been introduced. It's coming in 2024, we hope, we're told. There's still consultation going on between the debt advice deliverers, agencies, and the government to sort of work through how it's going to work. There is an existing scheme in Scotland already, but we're not quite sure who's going to be doing a lot of the work. I think one thing we found when Breathing Space was introduced, there was quite a lot that a debt advisor needs to do as part of that. So we don't know whether it's going to be similar with the statutory debt repayment plan. And then you've got personal insolvency options. So I'll quickly run through each one. Again, in brackets, it tells you whether you need surplus income or not to go into them. So an administration order, they're a bit rarer now. I've only come across one working as a debt advisor. You do need surplus income, but to go into one, you have to have less than £5,000 debt. You have to have a CCJ. You have to have 2 or more debts. And how it works is the court will look at your financial situation and they will arrange a monthly repayment plan, which is then administered by the court for the term of it. An individual voluntary arrangement is a legally binding agreement between the debtor and the creditor, which allows them to pay their debts over a period of time. It's usually 5 years. If there's no property, if there's a property, then it can go a bit longer than 5 years. There's no upper limit, there's no maximum upper limit debt-wise, but we'd usually look at debts between, I don't know, £10,000, maybe £20,000. There isn't an upper limit, but the reason we sort of think about that and we're not quick to put people in an IVA is because there are fees involved in an IVA. The fees are front loaded normally, which means that in your IVA, your first few payments are made, the first few payments you make go towards the fees and not the debt. But usually at the start of the IVA, there is a meeting of all the creditors you owe money to, and they will vote. So there are voting houses. They will be told, this is the proposal for the IVA. This is how much of your debt you'll get written off at the end of it. And they vote whether they agree with it or whether they want to go into it. There is a few sticking points with IVAs where whoever has the largest proportion of debt can sway the decision, usually. And there are, once you've been in the debt world for a while, there are creditors who will always vote no for an IVA. So if you kind of know who they are and the fact they will vote no, and if they have a lot of debt owed to that person, then you may not necessarily want to look at an IVA as an option for that client. The last thing to say about that is that IVAs have been abused because of the fees involved. The government and debt advice agencies, there's a lot of noise around it and trying to look at the rules around IVAs to make sure that providers are offering choice and not automatically saying have an IVA because they're going to make money off it. Because we see a lot of people on benefits on IVAs, and it's not always the appropriate option if someone's getting, it just has a benefit income, basically. The great thing about IVAs is that they protect your assets. So if you have a home, you won't lose it. In the 4th or 5th year of your IVA, they will ask you to release equity from your home to pay into the IVA. If you can't do that, then the IVA will last 6 years rather than 5 years. And most people, because they have debt, people won't offer a remortgage, they won't get the release of equity, but it stops them from losing their home. You then have the write-off option. So both of them are DROs, or debt relief orders, and bankruptcies. They're both write off your debt and give you a fresh start, but they're very different. So a debt relief order is a way to deal with your debt if you owe less than £30,000, you don't own a home, you don't have a car worth more than £2,000, and you don't have spare income of more than £75. A debt relief order, you go into it, you pay £90 to the insolvency service, and they will freeze your debt for a year. At the end of the year, as long as your circumstances haven't changed, they write it off. In that year, if you win the lottery, get an inheritance, start earning money where you have loads of disposable income, then you have a legal obligation to let the insolvency service know, and they will revoke your DRO and you will become liable for your debts again. If nothing like that happens, then they write it off and you're cleared, fresh start, you're no longer liable after the year. With a DRO, to have a debt written off, it has to be on the application form. If it's not on the application form, it isn't written off. This is quite different to bankruptcy. So bankruptcy is another write-off options. There aren't strict criteria around it. There's no upper limit. You can have millions of pounds of debt and go bankrupt. It does cost £680 to go bankrupt, which is a bit ironic, considering that you're saying I can't pay my debts, but you still have to find that money. But there are charities that will pay for the fees for you, grants and things like that you can access, both for DRO and for the bankruptcy. With bankruptcy, it's like an umbrella option. If the debt isn't on the application, it is still included in the bankruptcy. So it doesn't necessarily need to be on there. There is no waiting time, like with a DRO. As soon as you apply and it's been approved, your debts are gone. You're debt free. It doesn't matter what happens beyond that point, you're never going to be liable for those debts again. Obviously, with bankruptcy, assets are not protected. If you have an asset, the official receiver will go after it. There are some rules and regulations around things like property, which I won't go into, but there are things that can be done, and there's like a time scale for selling the property, and if they don't do it in that time, it reverts back to you. But I'm not going to go into all that. It is a good option. The stigma around bankruptcy isn't as bad as it is. People think, oh, I'm going to lose everything, I won't have a bank account. That's not the case anymore. The financial industry understands some people need to go bankrupt, they need to go insolvent, and you can still have a basic bank account. You may not have an overdraft or all the extra perks, but you can still have a bank account if you go bankrupt. Now, once you go into these options, then, as I said before, it really limits what the creditor can do. They can't contact you, they can't ask you to pay, they can't take you to court, they can't do much really once you're in an official form of insolvency. Okay, now I've got some example cases, and I'm kind of hoping people will sort of get involved and give me their views. So these are all real clients that I've dealt with. So the first one was an investment banker based in London. He had nigh on £1 million debt. He was addicted to gambling, and he'd gambled away quite a lot of money that he was meant to be investing, including £250,000 from his mother. I did a budget for him. He didn't have hardly any money left after paying his essentials bills. But he'd come thinking, all I can do is bankruptcy, you need to help me, but can you tell me if it's going to affect my pension? So I was just wondering what people think. Do you think bankruptcy is the only option for this person, or do you think maybe they could have thought about something else as well? Any ideas? No? Okay, so this client, his only option was indeed bankruptcy. Yeah, that's right, Tanya. It was bankruptcy. However, I think it came as a bit of a surprise to him because I think he was worrying about the wrong thing. It was quite a difficult conversation to kind of explain to him that just because you go bankrupt doesn't mean that all responsibility is taken away from you. There are offences linked with bankruptcy, and there are things the official receiver will consider. So I'll just quickly talk through the two main offences. So one is a preferential payment, and the other is a transaction at an undervalue. So a preferential payment is where you have 6 creditors of a different variety, and you're paying one or two, but not the other. So the ones you're paying, you keep using that credit, but you're ignoring the rest. That's frowned upon. Ideally, you need to treat all your creditors equally. And if you have been preferring one, you have to have a good reason for it. Transaction at undervalue is I'm Donald Trump. I'm struggling in my business. I want to go bankrupt. I don't want to lose my mansion in Malibu. So I go to my mate and I say, right, I'm going to sell you my mansion. You know, it's really worth £1 million, but I'll sell it to you for 500,000. And then what we can do is, you know, I'll buy it back for maybe a little bit extra than what you paid for it once I've sorted all this bankruptcy stuff out. You can't do that. That's you trying to hide your assets so that the official receiver can't get their hands on it, and you're selling something for less than what it's worth to do that. So the sale will become null and void if the official receiver finds out that you've done anything like that in the last 2 to 5 years before you went bankrupt. But another thing they look at is how you've accrued your debt. So this client is an investment banker. As a result, he deals with money. People trust him. They give him their money to invest. He's gambled it all away. They will look at, is he getting help for his gambling? And potentially with this client, because of the amount of debt he's actually accrued, the official receiver can apply to the court for criminal charges. He could end up in prison as well, just because of what's happened. And in addition to that, they will also put a restriction on him, which is like a punishment. And usually if you go insolvent, you're discharged after a year, but they can extend that 15, 20, 30 years. And when you have a restriction on you, it means you can't access credit, you can't run a company. So it really limits what you're able to do in that period until you're discharged. The good thing with him is his pension was safe. Pensions are protected as long as you're not accessing your pension. So you're not getting monthly payments or you're not getting a lump sum out of your pension. And he had a really good pension, about £500,000. So that was protected. So what he was worried about was okay. But I think, as I said before, he was worried about the wrong thing. He never came back to me after I gave the advice. So I don't know whether he went ahead and became bankrupt. I think the only other thing to say is with bankruptcy, you can do it yourself. Gov.uk, apply for bankruptcy, fill in your form, pay your fees, click a button, you're bankrupt. A DRO, you need a debt advisor to do that for you. Right, our second client owns his own home, 28 grand debt, council tax, credit cards, criminal fine for speeding. He does have £200 left. Can anyone think what we'd do for this one? Do bear in mind he owns a home, which he'd preferably not lose. Any ideas? Okay, so with this one, the advice was mainly an IVA. So whilst an IVA did have fees involved, he needed to protect his house, and he did have money to pay his debts. So by going into IVA, he would pay some of the 28,000, but not all of it. He was aware about the fact he might have to release equity. He wasn't bothered about that because I think in his case, it's probably unlikely he would have been able to do that. So he would pay a 6-year period of £200. My maths isn't that amazing that I could work it out off the top of my head, but it wouldn't amount to the 28 grand. He'd pay less than the 28 grand. So whatever he'd paid, the rest of it would then be written off. The last one is a debt relief order. I'm not gonna, because of time. This client, he was on benefits, 15 grand debt. He did have a car, but he'd been adapted because of his disability, so it was exempt, it was safe. And we went for DRO for him. He could have also gone bankrupt, but if you can pay £90, and because he was disabled, it wasn't likely his circumstance would change in a year. So we paid the £90, and then after a year, his debt got written off. But bankruptcy is an option. And I think one thing that I find a bit frustrating sometimes, I've seen with all the debt advisors I've trained, is that as a debt advisor, as you're asking questions, your mind's already ticking ahead and you're thinking, right, this person's really great. I'm probably going to be a DRO I'm going to go for. But I think what people forget is that you have to always give choice. Bankruptcy is almost always an option for most people, unless they have a home or an asset. But for someone who can go for a DRO and can go for bankruptcy, you should still talk about bankruptcy. Don't automatically just talk about DRO, because that person might not want to wait for the year. They might want their debts gone there and then. They might be concerned about becoming liable for their debts again in a year, and they may be willing to pay the 680 rather than the 90 just to get that. Okay, so that's the end of the debt section. So I'm gonna give everybody a little, like a 5-minute break. If you want to go and get a brew, and then we'll crack on with benefits as the next section. Yeah. So if we come back, if we say it's 10:43, so if we come back at 10 to 11, that'd be grand. That's what I mean. Okay, so I'm gonna crack on then with benefits. So I actually think benefits is probably one of the hardest areas of advice that you can work in. I think the reason I say that is because when you do benefits, you have to constantly think about how one benefit interacts with the other benefit. You have to think about regular changes in legislation, either by central government making amendments or tweaking it. When a new government comes in, there's a new benefit introduced, or the benefit system is changed slightly, or the rules are changed slightly. And you also have to think about changes to the legislation based on precedent. So that's basically where someone has challenged a decision, maybe around human rights, them not being able to claim a benefit, whatever it is. That's been agreed, and then that means that you can make an argument to claim that benefit based on that precedent. And then boom, before you know it, someone else has taken that that decision to Supreme Court, and suddenly it's changed again, or to the European courts. So there's a lot of changes with benefits, and you have to really be on the ball and keep an eye on what those changes are, especially if you're working as a specialist benefit advisor. So if someone comes to you with a benefit issue, you need to try and find out, first and foremost, do they have recourse to public fund? Are they a British citizen? Can they claim benefits? If they're not a British citizen, on what basis are they here? Right of abode, right to reside. There are no restrictions. You just have to check those things, because if there are restrictions or they can't claim benefits, then you should be thinking about a different service to signpost them to, one that supports people who are refugees, asylum seekers, whatever it is, because we might not be able to help them maximize income through the benefit system. As long as the client is eligible for benefit, then you want to know who lives in the house with them. You want to know whether they have a partner. Does the partner work? If they work, how many hours? What do they earn? You want to know if they have non-dependent children. If they do, are they at uni? Are they disabled? Are they working? If they're working, how much do they earn? How many hours do they do? Do they have children? Because you can then look at the children's benefits. So it's really important to know who lives in the house, and wherever possible, get dates of birth, because there were a lot of quite significant changes to the benefit system in 2017, and having dates of birth of children and things like that is quite helpful, because there are some restrictions on children's benefits that came into place in 2017. You then want to look at their income. So do they work? Obviously, you can get benefits even if you work, universal credit. So do they work? Are they already getting disability benefits? Are they dependents or non-dependents getting disability benefit? Do they have savings? So with most benefits, there's an upper threshold and a lower threshold. So if you have savings above the upper threshold, you're not eligible at all. If you have savings above the lower threshold, then it's working out what the taper is. So depending on how much above you have, your benefit entitlement is reduced incrementally. depending on how much over that you've obviously got. And then you want to look at their property. Do they rent? Do they own their home? If they rent or own, how many bedrooms do they have in the property? If they rent in, is it private? Is it social housing? And a lot of that ties into local housing authority rates. So if you're in private rented accommodation, there's a maximum amount that they'll give you for housing costs or housing elements of universal credit. Or if you're on legacy benefits, there's a maximum amount for housing benefit if you're on the old benefits. So these are some of the questions that you need to ask wherever possible. As soon as someone comes to you and say, I have an issue with my benefit, you need that background information because it kind of dictates what you then do going forward. Right, it's really important to look at existing benefits because there are so many people. I think pension credit is a really big one. A lot of local authorities have millions of pounds of unclaimed pension credit just sat there, and there's a drive at the moment to encourage, people of pension age to claim pension credit, not just because it's an additional income, but even for people who are entitled to a very small amount. There's passported benefits that they can get as a result of being on pension credit. I work in energy, so for example, there's a lot of the large scale measures you can make to your property so it's insulated, but you have to be on pension credit. There are things like warm homes discount, so there are a lot of extras you get just because you get that benefit. So even if someone's only entitled to a very tiny amount because they get state pension or private pension, it's still worth claiming that all the same. Obviously, when you're speaking to someone as an advisor, you want to get them, make sure they're claiming all the benefits they should get, but you also want to make sure that the benefits they're getting is correct and that the DWP, HMRC, they are aware of your circumstances, because there will be people who have had a change of circumstance. They've not told anybody and they're still getting a benefit they maybe shouldn't be getting. And I think it's about looking at that and saying to the person, look, you shouldn't be getting this. You need to tell them. You're probably going to have an overpayment. And for me, having a background in debt, those are the things I would look at when I do a benefit calculation as part of debt advice, because that's a debt waiting to happen. And I don't want to do anything that then puts that person at a detriment. They could get their debts written off and then tomorrow they have this overpayment of benefit and they're still having to pay that debt. So it's always worth looking to make sure that they're not getting too little or too much benefit. Now, there are lots of benefit calculators out there that are available, some easier to use than the others. There's Policy in Practice, Entitled To, Turn to Us, there's QBC, so there's a variety. And a lot of them, the online ones, they're really, really good. Some are still being tweaked and adjusted. And I think in as much as what it tells you you're going to get may not necessarily be what you will get, is a very good indicator for clients. So if you're going to send someone and say it might be worth going and doing a benefit calculation, then you need to make sure you're telling them what they will need for that, which is, details of any savings, income, so pay slips, details of any benefits they're already getting, their outgoings, are they paying for childcare, because obviously you can get a percentage of that on the universal credit and on the tax credits as well, and what their council tax bill is as well. I think council tax is a funny one because each local authority is slightly different and how the DWP works is slightly different. Usually if you're claiming UC, I think there's a box you tick, which then means that an application for council tax reduction is fairly automatic, but that's not always the case. And people need to understand they are separate things. Council tax reduction is not part of universal credit, and it's always in your interest as a client to go and fill in the form on your council website and not assume because you applied for UC, you're just going to automatically get council tax reduction. Okay, and then one thing I wanted to put on here is just a bit of caution around benefit calculators. I think whilst it's great that people can go off and claim do a calculation, it will tell them they can get X, Y, Z. If someone's already getting the old type of benefits, which I've got a list of on here, so these are the old benefits that are being phased out through natural or managed migration. So managed migration is basically where eventually anybody still on the old benefits will be asked to move over. Natural migration is basically where you have a change of circumstance, you're getting the old benefits. As soon as that change happens, you have to go on to universal credit because there are no new applications for the old benefits available anymore. But I think why I've put this on here is that we don't want people going and applying for UC and being taken off legacy benefits when they may not need to. The reason being, as with anything new, there are a lot of people who are worse off on universal credit than what they are on the old benefits. So we would kind of encourage them to stay on the old benefit as long as possible until the DWP, whoever it is, move them over, rather than have them do something that means they get automatically moved across. There's quite a large difference. Some people, £500 difference a month if they go from legacy to universal credit. And a lot of it is linked with, as an example, premiums that are part of disability benefits. So if you get ESA and you're awarded disability benefit at a certain level, then you get an extra amount added to your ESA. So on universal credit, that is there, but it's not there for the entirety of whilst you're getting a benefit. So there's a transition where you get an amount, but then it slowly goes down until you're not getting anything afterwards. So they're phasing out a lot of the premiums on the universal credit that people were getting on the legacy benefits. So it's just always worth, if someone's come to you, they're on legacy benefit, they should get advice from someone who's a bit more specialist so that they can obviously tell them whether it's a good idea or not to go ahead and move across. Okay, so I've put disability benefits. This is the bulk of probably what I'm going to talk about under benefits because we have limited time, but I've put disability benefits because it's something we get quite common coming through. I think since COVID and people struggling financially, there's been this rush to claim disability benefits to maximize income to get more money in. But I think what people are forgetting is how it works. Having a disability doesn't mean you get a disability benefit. It's more about how that disability affects you. That's what they actually look at. And as a result of the increased number of claims, there's an 18-week delay. I checked this, I don't know, a month and a half ago. There's an 18-week delay with the DWP actually looking at new claims. So if you put in a claim, it could take like 4 months before you even hear anything back from the Department of Work and Pensions. So just to give you an overview, these are some of the things that they will look at when you're claiming a disability benefit. So disability benefits include DLA, which is Disability Living Allowance, which is 16 years and under can get it. PIP, Personal Independence Payments, is an adult disability benefit. And then attendance allowance is for those of retirement age and over. Now, there are other things like employment and support allowance or being on the limited capability for work-related activity under universal credit where you get extra money, but those are also linked with having a medical assessment. So when you claim a disability benefit, usually you have to go and have a medical assessment. They will look at all these points based on what you filled in your form, and they will award points for each one. And if you get a set number of points, they will give you the benefit. If you score below, then you won't get the benefit and you may have to challenge it or appeal it. So this is what they normally look at. And it's around, can you make a journey? Are you okay going out on your own? Can you understand what people are saying to you? Can you feed yourself? Can you wash yourself? Do you need support or help or care to do those things? And I think the only extra thing I wanted to add is that a disability can be mental, physical, behavioral, learning, or developmental. So all of those things are covered. Some are harder to get than others, as is always the way. If you have a very visible disability, then usually people just assess you on that. But for people with mental health, it can be quite difficult when you go to that assessment, which personally, my opinion, is not fit for purpose, because I feel like it's a snapshot view of you, in an hour, a couple of hours, however long it takes. It doesn't give them a true indication of just how much help and support you need. Um, and it's just worth knowing that quite a high percentage, 60–70% of claims that are refused are overturned when you challenge it and go to the tribunal. And that kind of just shows you how not fit for purpose the assessment actually is. Now, with disability living allowance, which is the one for children, I will say it can be very difficult to get that where the child is under 3 years old, because a child under 3 inevitably needs more care, more support. So you'd have to have that backed up by quite a lot of medical documentation for you to get it. But for children, it's normally around looking at how much extra care or support does that child need when compared to another child of the same age, basically. And if you can show that, then usually you will be awarded the benefit. With a lot of them, you have to have had your disability for 3 months and expect it to last for another 6. That differs slightly depending on which benefit, but there is a period where you have to have had it for before you can then put in an application. So here, what I've done is I've just given you an example to show you how 2 people with the same health condition are so different that one would get disability benefit and the other wouldn't. So Billy has epilepsy, he's getting medication, it manages his condition really, really well, and he hardly has any seizures. And then you've got Sarah, who also has epilepsy, but they've not found that right combination of medication for her. So she's constantly having seizures and she needs someone with her all the time. And that is because she could have a seizure, fall, hit her head, hurt herself seriously. She could be walking down the road or crossing the street and have a seizure. So someone has to be with her. And as a result, she needs more care. She needs more support. So Sarah would potentially get the benefit because she can show that she needs support with X, Y, Z and get those points. But Billy can't show that because he's living a relatively normal life because of the medication that's obviously managing his condition. So it just gives you that view of 2 people and what you need to think about. Because I think as someone who works for a charity, we have limited resource. We don't have loads and loads of money. So when people come to us, we have to merit that, supporting them with a form. And it might be that we have that conversation and say, well, from what you're telling me and the evidence you've provided, we don't think you're going to be awarded PIP, DLA, whatever it is. But you can apply. You're not stopping them applying, but a form can take 2 hours. And it's making that decision about whether you want to spend your resource filling in a form where you have a really good, there's a clear indication they might not get it. I've got headaches, I get migraines. Well, how does it affect you? Well, I might need to lie down for a little bit and then it's better. So you wouldn't want to be wasting time filling in that form. It's not to say you're not saying don't do it. You might give them guidelines to do it themselves, but it's whether you then choose to do it for them. And the same goes for challenging decisions. A specialist will merit a case and decide whether it's worth them doing all the extra work of taking it to tribunal, depending on whether it will be successful or not. Okay. The only other thing I wanted to add, this is obviously in line with what I said before, and there are links to all the different benefits, but I wanted to talk about special rules. So where someone is getting end of life care, you can apply to get a disability benefit quicker. So you can get it faster, it's easier to access the benefits, you usually get higher payments of the benefits, and you may not need to have a medical assessment. So it's a special form that you'd fill in. I think it's called a DS 1500, I want to say. You'd fill that in to claim it under special rules. You normally need a clinician, a GP, a hospital consultant, a hospice nurse, someone like that, to provide medical evidence. And if you can provide that, then yes, you can get the benefit a lot quicker. So that's just something to bear in mind when you're supporting people. Okay, so all benefits, most benefits can be challenged. And as I said, there are links to the process you need, but I'm going to talk about them generally. A lot of people come because they've had a decision, a negative decision. They've not been awarded a benefit, or they've been told they're suddenly not eligible anymore. So a lot of the benefits, there's the first step, which you can do in a month after you've had your decision letter, within a month, which is a mandatory reconsideration. And what you're doing is asking whoever's made the DWP normally to look at the decision again, because you think that they've made a mistake. They will look at it, they will come back and say, no, we don't think we've made a mistake, you're not entitled. And then at that point, you can go to an independent tribunal to challenge the decision. What I find is that a lot of mandatory reconsiderations don't actually, they're not done to change the decision, which I don't think is ideal. And you know, Citizens Advice is guilty of this. You just want to get it in there as quick as possible. And we found that a lot of decisions just weren't changed at that stage. But that's because you're not supporting it with evidence. So it's always good at that stage to send as much evidence as you can, as much information as you can, because sometimes the DWP will change the decision at that stage, and it just stops that person from being without their benefit for months and months while you go to tribunal. If you can nip it in the bud there, then that's always a good thing, and that's why it's there. So it's always worth putting the effort for the mandatory reconsideration if you can. Now, if you don't get your mandatory reconsideration or if you don't challenge a decision within the month, you do have a year to do it, but you usually have to have a good reason for not doing it, you know, within the month period. But you can still challenge that decision. So that's something to bear in mind when someone comes to you. For tax credits, it's 30 days, but we probably won't be seeing many of those going forward, obviously, because they're being phased out, or tax credit is being phased out. Now, with a mandatory reconsideration on universal credit, you can put something on your online journal to ask for a decision to be looked at again. You can fill in the CRM, what is it, CRMR1 form, or you can write a letter to basically say you're challenging a decision, and then they will look at that decision again. I've put some extra information around child benefit, guardians allowance, and little links to how you can go about challenging those decisions as well, if that's something you come across. Okay, I think this is probably the last slide for benefits, and it's just like me saying to you, if something is complicated, you're not sure what you're going to do, don't know what to do, send the person to someone who does. It doesn't have to be Citizens Advice. It can be any advice agency that gives benefit advice, because it's always important that, you know, our clients have that support they need. And not a lot of them know how to navigate the benefit system. So having someone to help them with it improves, obviously, the chances of success if you're challenging a decision or claiming any sort of benefit. Okay, so I'm going to move on and go into energy. So energy then. As I'm sure all of you know, we can decide who we want to buy our gas and electricity from. Energy advice has changed quite a lot since the energy crisis started. You know, a few years ago, I was managing energy advisors, and all they would normally do is go on a price comparison website, do a search, and automatically they'd save the client £300-400. That was usually what you did. You talked to them about warm homes discount, winter fuel payments, and then that was your job done, maybe a bit of energy efficiency. Now it's very, very different. We have clients coming to us who have been in hospital, come back home, and suddenly they've gone from not being on a prepayment meter to being on a prepayment meter. We have clients who have made complaints to supplier, months, nothing's happened. They can't get hold of their supplier. Some have even had decisions made by the energy ombudsman, but the supplier's just not done anything about it. We have people being billed incorrectly. There's just all, and obviously a majority is people who just can't afford to pay. So there's just debt, 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 debt. And because, again, there are limitations on what you can do, like grants to help with debts. Sometimes we're getting people coming who we've done everything for them. They've had a DRO, they've had a grant, and there's just nothing you can do. So it's a sticking plaster job a lot of the time, which can be quite difficult when someone's saying, I have no money, I have no money. As you all know, obviously the reasons why the prices have gone up is because wholesale price of gas went up. It has come down of late, the wholesale price, but retail price isn't coming down as quick as we would like. Petrol station, yes, things are cheaper, but my understanding is that it's going to take a while before we actually see it in our bills coming down. So it's likely that the prices are going to stay high for quite a while yet. January, we thought there'd be an increase. That's not happened as a result of some prices coming down. We're not quite sure what's going to happen in April. Indication mean that it may still go up, but we don't know. We also don't know what the government are going to do in April when the support schemes they put in place have ended. They're kind of telling us that it might continue, but there'll be stricter criteria. It won't be for everybody. It will be for specific people depending on their circumstances. So we're not all going to get that help that's been in place in the past. Okay, so switching is something we get a lot. At the moment, we don't recommend people switch. We tell them to just stick with their supplier. We also don't recommend people look at fixed tariffs because it's just been a bit of a volatile market. In September last year, I was being told, go on a fixed tariff for 3 years, costing me £700 a month. I was like, no chance. That's like a mortgage. And I'm glad I did it because I carried on paying 200, now I'm on £400 because the prices have gone up, but it's still less than 700. And I'm just on the variable tariff that tracks the price of fuel as I go along. So I'm glad I didn't go on fixed. So people who went for fixed at the start at a higher rate are probably at a detriment because they're now stuck paying that fixed rate. And then people who didn't have carried on paying obviously a lower amount. So we probably say it is worth speaking to suppliers, see what tariffs they've got, but compare it to what you're already paying and maybe get some advice. Is it better to go on a fix? Is it not? But a lot of the time you're unlikely to save money if you do switch. Now, if you are determined to switch, then what we would say is that you look at customer service. That's becoming a big issue. Citizens Advice, they have a customer service rating on our website. The link is on there. And especially if you have a vulnerability, it's worth checking. Is that supplier going to look after you? Because we're just finding so many of them aren't. They're just doing whatever they want at the moment. So it's worth checking whether they have good customer service before you decide to switch. Do a price comparison, check your existing agreement to make sure there's no exit fee on there. And obviously always take readings on the day that you are switching over. And this also applies to moving house as well. I've put like a little flow chart on here, which you'll all have access to, that tells you exactly what happens as you go through the process of switching. So if you're wanting to switch and you're in debt with your supplier, then it is possible that they'll stop you from switching. If a client is in debt, we'd always say price wherever possible. Now, if you have a prepayment meter and you owe less than £500 for each fuel, so gas or electricity, then your debt can transfer with you. So you can switch and you may benefit from having lower deductions taken from your meter when you put credits on by switching. So if your prepayment less than 500, they'll probably let you switch. If you don't have a prepayment meter and you have a debt, then they have a right to prevent you from moving to another supplier. you have to stick with that supplier until you clear the debt. The only time they can't stop you leaving is if it's their fault that you're in debt. So as an example, they've billed you incorrectly, then they can't stop you from moving to a new supplier. So I'm going to briefly talk about the energy price guarantee, which we know the government put in place. The only reason I put this on here is because this is a slightly older slide, because I remember Liz Truss constantly kept saying, oh, nobody's going to pay more than 2,500, which obviously wasn't the case. And people were wondering, why is this woman going around saying this on TV when she doesn't understand that it's obviously the price per unit that's capped. So if you live in a big house and you use lots of units, even though the price is capped, you will pay more for your fuel because you use more. It's like someone going to a shop. If you go to a shop and something costs £10 and you buy 2 of them, it'll cost you £20. But if you're buying 50 of them, it will definitely cost you a lot more than £20. So it's how much you use that's what actually matters. And I've just put details on here about what the cap is. In April, we're thinking that it might go up. I think it will go up to, well, I've heard a few numbers banded around 2,800 potentially, but we're kind of waiting to see what the government's going to decide. Okay. The next slide is a little video I'm going to play, and it just tells you about bills and things to look at when you get a bill. This is on here because clients don't understand their bills, and I think this is a really good video to explain the different parts of your gas and electric bill. And as an advisor, it also helps you to understand what you need to look at when you're looking at someone's bill. It is directed at the Scottish market, so just ignore that bit of it. We're working on a video that's more for England, but it is still a really good video to watch. I'm going to play that now for everyone.
Hi, my name's Rebecca and I'm from Home Energy Scotland. This video will help you to understand your gas and electricity bills and identify and avoid some common problems which can occur with them. Gas and electricity bills contain lots of useful information. Although bills from each energy supplier will look different, they should all contain the following information: your name and address, the name of your energy supplier, a customer reference or account number, what tariff you are currently on for your gas and electricity. The tariff is the price you pay per unit of gas or electricity, along with any standing charge. Tariffs are identified by their name, which can be found on your bill. Examples include standard or fixed price July 2018. The tariff comparison rate, the amount of gas and electricity you have used in the past year. The serial numbers for your gas and electricity meters. A record of the gas and electricity meter readings used to calculate how many units of energy you have used. And the amount of money you are due to your energy supplier, and a breakdown of the charges. The first thing to check is that all of the information is correct. First, check that the name on the bill is right and that it isn't addressed to the occupier. Next, check that the address details are correct. Make sure the dates which the billing period covers are not before or after you lived in the property. Check that the meter serial numbers match the ones written on your gas and electricity meters. If these or any other details are wrong, contact your supplier to make sure they are corrected, and a new bill should be sent out to you. Estimated meter readings can also cause problems with your gas and electricity bills. If your bill says estimated on the front or shows estimated readings, then you may be paying too much or too little for your gas or electricity. To avoid this, take accurate meter readings and provide them to your energy supplier, who should be able to send out an accurate bill. In the next few years, most households will have smart meters installed. If you have a smart meter, your meter readings should not be estimates. Since April 2014, energy suppliers have been required to display tariff comparison rates on gas and electricity bills. These allow you to make a quick comparison with other tariffs based on average gas and electricity usage. Although the tariff comparison rate is useful, Using annual usage amounts for gas and electricity is best to carry out a more thorough check for better tariffs. Annual usage figures should also be found on your bills, or you can contact your supplier to find out this information. Annual usage is measured in kilowatt hours and can be used with tariff comparison websites to carry out a more detailed search on the best tariffs available for you. Many problems with gas and electricity bills arise when you move property. When you move, always take final meter readings from the previous property and contact your previous supplier to close the account at that property. Take gas and electricity meter readings on the day you take responsibility of your new property and give these to the existing gas and electricity supplier of the new property. In your new property, you can change supplier once you have given your meter readings. So, to recap, if you're having problems with your gas or electricity bills, check that your details are correct on the bill. Avoid estimated readings by giving your supplier actual meter readings. Check your tariff is competitive using the tariff comparison rates on the bill or doing a tariff check, and give meter readings to the supplier for your previous and new properties when you move house. For more information on saving money on your gas and electricity bills,
Okay, so just a little bit extra on the video. I just wanted to basically say I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit now. Smart meters are a good thing. She mentioned everybody's going to go on a smart meter. So they are a good thing. I have a smart meter and it helps me to look at my usage daily. I can compare it to a specific day last year. I can adjust my direct debit accordingly. So it's great for me, but I do all that online. Not everybody can go online and look at that information. So that's something we have to we have to bear in mind initially. Another issue is that at the moment, suppliers are using smart meters as a backdoor to put people onto prepayment meters. So a smart meter can be switched from pay monthly to prepayment just by pushing a button. So they can do it remotely. Nobody comes to your property to do it. It just happens. And I think because suppliers have targets of fitting smart meters, they're trying to meet that target as well as make sure their debts are paid. And that's not what it's supposed to do. So it's really important, because if someone can't have a smart meter for whatever reason, then they shouldn't have one put in. There is no legal obligation for you to have a smart meter. It's your choice, and suppliers shouldn't tell you otherwise. So that's just something to bear in mind when you're speaking to people. It's not always a good option for everybody. Okay. So these are just some of the schemes that are available to help when someone has an energy debt or they're struggling to pay their bills. Because of time, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but there are links on there that you can access that give you a lot more information around all of them as well. There's also a video on all of those schemes, which is part of the slides, and you can go and watch that video if you prefer to look at it visually rather than reading the information. I'll play that. And just to finish off, I just wanted to basically talk about Priority Service Register. It's so important that if you speak to anyone who meets any of this criteria, you either sign them up to the Priority Service Register with their supplier, or you get them to do it themselves. If you go on Electricity Northwest, you can do it for your client there. The reason I'm saying this is because there are a lot of people with health conditions, and some of the stuff that's happening at the moment, the suppliers are doing, they shouldn't be doing if that person is on a Priority Service Register. So it means you have improved access to your meter. There's a password protection scheme. You can get free gas safety checks. They tell you when there's going to be a power cut. And for people who have medical machines running in their homes, that's really important. And they have to take into account your circumstances and your vulnerabilities before they do anything. So if the client is on this, it gives them some additional protection. So do please just bear this in mind. And this is definitely my last slide. This just goes through some of the things we do when people have a debt. So Fuel Direct, if you're on benefits, you can have your ongoing gas arrears, so your gas payments and arrears deducted from your benefits. I talked about the vulnerability protections. Prepayment meters can help with paying debts. Obviously, if you're on a prepayment, you do pay more for your gas and electricity, but at least you're paying off the debt as you put credit on. Support for meter top-ups. Your supplier can top up your meter if you're struggling. Some are offering quite a substantial amount of top-up depending on your circumstance. So it's always worth telling people to speak to their supplier. Then obviously Citizens Advice, we offer fuel vouchers, £49 at the moment. There's a limit on how many you can have. I think it's 3 and 6 months, but we can give more depending on circumstance. So you can always refer them. There are loads of organizations that give vouchers as well. And then there's charitable grants, which we can apply to help clear your debts. And I know Citizens Advice, we have a few pots of money depending on which local authority you're from, where we can support you to clear some or all of your debts as well. And this is just any additional information you need, or if you need to signpost someone, this is how you can do it to us. And that's it. We're done. And I think I'm just on time, which I'm really pleased about.